Colonel Raymond Voss slammed his fist on the console and turned to the room with fire in his eyes. "Get her out of here," he barked, pointing directly at Emily Carter. "I don't care what she thinks she saw. She is not qualified to speak in this room." Nobody moved. The clock on the wall read 11 minutes, 43 seconds. Captain Daniel Reeves was still falling, and the one person who might save him had just been ordered to leave. Before you hear what happened next, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The Nevada desert does not care about rank. It does not care about medals or flight hours or the number of stars on a man's collar. It does not care how many wars a pilot has survived, how many test flights he has completed, or how many times he has landed a broken aircraft on nothing but skill and prayer. When the desert opens its arms beneath 40,000 feet of empty sky, the only thing that matters is whether the machine above it is flying or falling. On a Tuesday morning in October, the X-51 Phantom was falling. Not slowly, not gracefully, not in the controlled way that engineers sometimes use the word when they mean a calculated descent. The X-51 was spinning. It was tumbling through the cold upper air in a violent, uncontrolled spiral that had begun 47 minutes earlier, when a software failure, the kind that wasn't supposed to exist in a billion-dollar aircraft, had locked the flight control system into a state that nobody in the ground command center had ever seen before. Not in simulation, not in theory, not in 17 years of combined test program history. The aircraft was not dead. That was the cruelest part of it. The engines were still running. The hydraulics were still pressurized. The aircraft's body was completely intact. From the outside, if you could somehow stand in that cold blue nothing at 40,000 feet and watch it pass, the X-51 Phantom would have looked almost beautiful, a sleek gray knife spinning through the air with perfect terrible symmetry. But inside that cockpit, Captain Daniel Reeves was not experiencing anything beautiful. I was experiencing the kind of fear that test pilots are trained to suppress, the kind that reaches up through your chest and grabs you behind the eyes and makes you forget for one horrible second everything you have ever learned. He had been spinning for 47 minutes. His instruments were giving him contradictory readings. His hands were on the stick, but the stick was not responding the way it was supposed to respond. He had tried every emergency procedure in the manual. He had tried procedures that weren't in any manual. He had spoken to the ground team 16 times in those 47 minutes, and every time the answer had been the same. "We're working on it, Reeves. Hold on." Hold on, as if holding on was a thing you could do when the world outside your cockpit was rotating at 62 degrees per second and your altitude was dropping at 1,100 feet per minute. Daniel Reeves was 38 years old. He had flown combat missions over 3 different continents. He had landed an F-16 with one engine and no hydraulics on a runway that was half the length it should have been. He had ejected from a burning aircraft over the Pacific Ocean and survived. He had 2 children, a boy named Marcus, who was 10 years old and collected baseball cards, and a girl named Sophie, who was 7, and had decided 3 weeks ago that she was going to be an astronaut. I thought about Marcus and Sophie now. He thought about them the way you think about people when you are not completely sure you are going to see them again. "Control," he said into his headset, and his voice was steady because test pilots train for years to keep their voices steady, even when everything inside them is screaming, "I'm showing 11,000 feet per minute descent rate. You need to tell me something different is happening down there. Tell me someone has an idea." In the underground command center, 60 miles away, nobody answered him immediately, because nobody had an idea. The room was large and cold and filled with the blue-white glow of monitors. There were engineers at their stations, 12 of them the best the Air Force had in the test program. There were communications technicians. There was a medical team standing quietly near the back wall, which was standard protocol during a critical incident and which nobody in the room was looking at, because looking at the medical team meant acknowledging what the medical team was there for. And there were 4 pilots. Colonel Raymond Voss stood at the center console with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression that people who knew him recognized as the look he got when he was fighting something, when he was refusing to accept what the numbers were telling him. Voss had been flying for 31 years. He had more flight hours than anyone else in the program. He had personally trained Daniel Reeves 12 years ago when Reeves was a young hotshot lieutenant who thought he knew everything about flying, and discovered under Voss's instruction that he knew almost nothing. Voss loved Reeves the way commanders sometimes love the pilots they train, with a fierce protectiveness that he would never say out loud and didn't need to. Beside Voss stood Major Thomas Garrett, who had spent 8 years as a combat test pilot before joining the classified program. Garrett was the kind of pilot who could explain in technical detail exactly why a maneuver was impossible, and then perform that maneuver anyway. He had a reputation for finding solutions in the final seconds of situations that everyone else had given up on. He had been trying to find a solution for 47 minutes, and his face was showing the strain of it in ways that people who knew him found deeply unsettling. The other two pilots were Colonel Sarah Mendez and Major Frederick Okafor. Between the four of them, they represented more than 30,000 hours in the air. 30,000 hours of climbing into machines that were faster and more complex and more dangerous than anything the public ever saw, and bringing those machines back to the ground in one piece. 30,000 hours of training for exactly this kind of moment. They had been working for 2 hours. Not 47 minutes since Reeves started spinning. 2 hours since the software failure had first been detected, since the preliminary warning systems had flagged an anomaly in the flight control network, since the engineering team had begun running diagnostics that should have taken 20 minutes and had instead revealed a problem that nobody knew how to solve. "Run the override sequence again," Voss said to the engineer on his left. "Colonel, we've run it 6 times. The system isn't accepting the command. It's treating the override as a threat input and locking down harder every time we try it. Then we try a different frequency, change the handshake protocol. Sir, we've changed it 4 different ways. The system is in a closed loop. Every input we send, whether it's an override, a reset, a partial shutdown, every single one of them is being interpreted by the AI as an attack on the aircraft's integrity. It's fighting us." Voss turned to Garrett. "Tom, talk to me." Garrett had not moved from his position in front of the main display for 11 minutes. His arms were at his sides. He was staring at the telemetry feed with an expression that made the engineers around him slightly nervous, because Garrett was the person in this room who was supposed to always have an answer, and right now his expression was saying something his voice was not willing to say yet. "I think," Garrett said slowly, "that we're looking at a software state that doesn't have a documented recovery procedure." The room got very quiet. "Say that again," Voss said. "I said I think we're in a state that doesn't have a documented recovery procedure, Ray. I've been through every protocol we have for AI-assisted flight system failures. I've been through the classified supplement. I've been through the emergency procedure tree 3 times. There is no established method for recovering a flight control AI that has entered a full defensive lockout while the aircraft is in an uncontrolled spin. There has to be something. I'm telling you what I'm finding." Voss turned to Mendez. "Sarah." Mendez had a tablet in her hand and had been scrolling through it with increasingly rapid movements for the past several minutes. She looked up, and the look on her face confirmed what Garrett had just said. "Tom's right," she said. "I've been looking at the original design documentation. The AI defensive lockout protocol was never intended to activate during flight. It was a ground maintenance feature that got incorporated into the flight system during the last software update. There's no flight recovery procedure because the designers never believed it could happen in the air." "Then we improvise," Voss said. "Frederick, you have been quiet. Give me something." Major Okafor uncrossed his arms and let out a slow breath. "Ray, I've been running the math on every possible control input, every one of them individually and in combination. The problem is not the maneuver. The problem is that every input we send the aircraft registers as hostile. You cannot force this system to comply. The more force you apply, the harder it locks. So we apply less force. Less force is still force. The system doesn't distinguish between a gentle correction and an aggressive override. To this AI, any external command right now is an attack. It's protecting the aircraft from us." Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. In a room where everyone was measuring time in seconds, 3 seconds was a long time. Control Reeves' voice came through the speaker, and there was something in it now that had not been there at the beginning of the crisis. Something that all 4 pilots in the room recognized immediately because they had all felt it themselves at some point in their careers, that particular quality that enters a pilot's voice when they have moved past fear and into the cold, clear place beyond it. "I'm at 31,000 feet. My descent rate is unchanged. If someone on the ground doesn't have something for me in the next few minutes, I need to know that too. I was not asking to be rescued. He was asking to know if he should start thinking about ejecting. Voss walked to the microphone. Daniel, we hear you. We are not done. I need 5 more minutes. Colonel, with respect, 5 minutes puts me at 26,000 feet. I'll still have envelope to work with, but 5 minutes, Captain. Voss's voice was exactly what it needed to be. Absolute, certain, even now. That's an order. A pause. Yes, sir. Voss turned away from the microphone and looked at the room. Someone give me something, he said. Anything. I don't care how insane it sounds. I don't care if it's in the manual. I need a new idea in this room right now. Nobody spoke. The engineers looked at their screens. The medical team near the back wall kept their faces carefully neutral. Garrett and Mendez and Okafor looked at the floor at the display at each other in the way that people look when they have been asked for something they are not sure they can give. And then from the corner of the room, a voice said, "What if we're asking the wrong question?" It was quiet. It was almost too quiet to hear over the sound of the ventilation system and the steady alarm tone that had been sounding for the past 40 minutes. But in a room that had just gone completely silent, quiet was enough. Everyone turned. Lieutenant Emily Carter was standing beside one of the secondary monitoring stations. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and wearing a uniform that fit her exactly the way regulations required and no more. She had been in the room for the entire 2 hours assigned there as a systems observer, a role that was in the hierarchy of this command center, approximately equivalent to the role of someone who stands near a fire and takes notes about the temperature. She was not a senior pilot. She was not on the primary recovery team. She had not spoken once in the past 2 hours. Colonel Voss looked at her. The way he looked at her was not warm. It was the look of a man who is under extreme pressure and has just been interrupted by the least expected person in the room. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "this is not the moment." "I understand that, Colonel." She did not move. "But I've been watching the telemetry, and I think there's something in the pattern that nobody has addressed." "Emily." It was Garrett who said her name, and his voice was not unkind, but it was firm in the way that people are firm when they are trying to manage a situation they are afraid is about to get complicated. "We've had 4 senior pilots with a combined 60 years of experience working this problem. If there was a pattern to catch, we would have caught it." "I know," Emily said. "I know you would have. But there's a reason you might have missed it." The room was silent. "What reason?" Mendez said, and her voice was neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging, which was more than most people in that room were giving. Emily took a breath. "Because you're all pilots." She said it simply. She was not trying to be provocative. She was not trying to be clever. She said it the way you say something that is true and that you have been thinking about for a long time and that you know is going to land badly, but that needs to be said anyway. Voss's eyes narrowed. "Explain yourself, Lieutenant." "You've all been approaching this as a control problem," Emily said. "A pilot problem. Your training is to take control of an aircraft in an emergency. So for 2 hours, you've been trying to take control. Every idea in this room has been about how to make the aircraft do what you want it to do." "That is the job," Okafor said. "Yes," Emily agreed. "In every scenario any of us has ever trained for, that's the job. But this isn't a normal control failure. The AI is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was programmed to do. It detected what it classified as a threat to the aircraft's integrity, and it locked down to protect the plane. Every command we've sent has been registered as a continuation of that threat. We're not fighting a malfunction, Major. We're in an argument with a machine that thinks we're trying to destroy it." The room was very still. Garrett turned slowly from the display. "Go on," he said. "The more we try to control it, the more the system believes the threat is real. It's a feedback loop. Every aggressive input escalates the AI's defensive response. We can't break in from outside the loop because every attempt to break in just makes the loop tighter." "So what are you suggesting?" Mendez said. Emily looked at the main display. The telemetry showed the X-51 still spinning, still descending, still broadcasting the alarms that had been constant background noise for the past 47 minutes. "I'm suggesting we stop trying to break in," she said. "I'm suggesting we let the loop break itself." Voss stared at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not agreement, not exactly, but the particular expression of a very experienced man encountering an idea that is foreign enough to be disturbing and compelling enough to be frightening. Then his expression closed down. "That is not a recovery procedure," he said. "That is giving up." "Colonel," I said. "No, Lieutenant. And I'll say it once more, clearly." He turned back to the console. "Get back to your station. We are not done working this problem." Emily did not move immediately. She stood exactly where she had been standing and looked at the telemetry display for 3 more seconds. In those 3 seconds, she was looking at something specific, a pattern in the data stream that she had been watching for the past 22 minutes, since the moment she had first seen it and begun the slow, careful work of understanding what it meant. Then she returned to her station, and Voss turned to the room and said, "Let's go back to the override sequence. There has to be a parameter we haven't adjusted." They worked. They were good at working. These were not people who gave up, not people who stopped when the problem was hard. They generated 3 new approaches to the override sequence in the next 7 minutes, and each one failed in the same way the others had failed, with the aircraft's AI registering the command as a hostile input and responding by tightening its defensive configuration. Control Reeves said, "I'm at 29,000. Voss looked at the clock. 8 minutes remaining, 8 minutes until the aircraft hit the threshold below which ejection became the only option. 8 minutes until Voss would have to order a pilot he had trained, a man he respected, to abandon a $1 billion aircraft and trust his life to a parachute above the Nevada desert. "Control copies," Voss said. "Hold your position." He turned to the room. There was something different in his face now. Not defeat, Raymond Voss, not due defeat, but something adjacent to it. Something like the recognition that the wall is real and that you have run out of the angles from which you thought you might find a door. "Ideas," he said flatly. "I need new ideas right now. Anything." Garrett shook his head almost imperceptibly. Mendez was still looking at her tablet with the expression of someone who has read the same page 8 times and is not going to find different information on the 9th reading. Okafor had his hands pressed flat on the console in front of him, as if the physical contact with something solid might generate something that pure thought had failed to provide. Emily Carter looked up from her station. She looked at Colonel Voss. Voss looked back at her. There was a long moment between them, and it was not a comfortable moment, and it was not a simple moment, because in that moment, both of them understood something that neither of them had said aloud yet. He had run out of ideas, and she had not. "Lieutenant Carter," Voss said, and his voice had something in it that was different from anything it had held for the past 2 hours, something careful and reluctant and real. "If you have something specific to say it now." Emily stood up from her station and walked to the center console. She pulled up the telemetry data on the secondary screen and pointed to a sequence in the AI behavioral log that had been running in the background unnoticed for 22 minutes. "The AI's defensive lockout doesn't run continuously," she said. "It cycles. Every 93 seconds, the system runs a self-diagnostic to determine whether the threat is still active. During that diagnostic, there is a 4-second window where the AI's defensive systems are in a reduced state." The room was very still. "A 4-second window," Garrett said slowly. 4.2 seconds based on the log I've been watching. It's consistent. It's happened 12 times in the 22 minutes I've been tracking it. Every 93 seconds, 4.2 seconds of reduced defensive response. "What can you do in 4.2 seconds, Okafor said. "Not much," Emily admitted. "You can't override the system. You can't restart it. You can't send a recovery command complex enough to work." She paused. "But you can send a single command, one instruction, one transmission in that 4-second window. Not a recovery procedure, not an override, just one thing." "What one thing?" Mendez said. Emily looked at the display. She looked at the spinning aircraft, the falling altitude, the steady cascade of alarm data that had been telling everyone in this room for 47 minutes that the situation was getting worse. "You tell the AI," she said quietly, "that there is no threat." Silence. Then Voss said, "That's not a recognized command format." "No, Emily has agreed. "It's not in any protocol document. But the AI's defensive lockout was triggered by a specific threat classification code. If we can send the inverse of that code, not an override, not a reset, just a simple flag that cancels the original threat classification, the AI might accept it during the diagnostic window, because in those 4 seconds, it's actually looking to confirm whether the threat is ongoing." Might, Voss said. Yes, sir, might. Garrett turned to the chief engineer. Marcus, is she right about the diagnostic window? Marcus Webb, the lead flight systems engineer, had been very quiet for the past 4 minutes. He was looking at his screen with an expression that suggested he had been looking at something and not saying what he was seeing. He cleared his throat. The window is real, he said. I see it in the log. I didn't flag it because I didn't have a use case for it. Lieutenant Carter is correct that the AI is running a periodic diagnostic. I cannot confirm or deny whether the inverse threat code would work because it's never been tested. But she's right about the architecture. The defensive lockout was designed with a periodic self-check built in. The question is whether the system will accept an inverse flag during those 4 seconds. And if it doesn't, Okafor said, then we're exactly where we are right now, Emily said. No better, no worse. We lose nothing by trying. Voss looked at her. He looked at her for a very long time. This has never been tested, he said. No, it's based on a pattern you've been watching for 22 minutes. Yes, and it requires us to send a command that doesn't exist in any recognized protocol. Yes, and your entire case, Voss said, is that there's a 4-second window every 93 seconds where the AI might be listening. Yes, sir, another long silence. Then Colonel Raymond Voss, who had been flying aircraft for 31 years and who did not like untested procedures, and who had spent the past 2 hours believing that the solution to this problem was going to come from the combined expertise of 4 of the most experienced test pilots in the United States Air Force, straightened his shoulders and looked at his chief engineer. Marcus, he said, how long to build the inverse flag command? Webb's hands were already moving on his keyboard. 11 minutes, he said, maybe 10. Voss looked at the clock. 8 minutes remaining. He looked at Emily. We don't have 11 minutes, he said. Emily said, I already built it. Another silence. A different kind of silence. I've been working on it for 22 minutes, she said quietly. While I was watching the window, I have it ready. We can send it at the next diagnostic cycle, which is, she looked at the behavioral log, 61 seconds from now. Nobody spoke. Then Voss looked around the room. He looked at Garrett, who gave him the very smallest, almost invisible nod. He looked at Mendez, who said nothing but did not look away. He looked at Okafor, who had the expression of a man who has just realized something he does not entirely know how to process. Then Voss looked at Emily Carter. Send it, he said. She was already at the console. 61 seconds. The room watched the clock. Nobody breathed. Outside, somewhere in the cold blue air above the Nevada desert, Captain Daniel Reeves was watching his altitude indicator and thinking about his son's baseball cards and his daughter's ambition to reach the stars, and holding on to the only thing any pilot can hold on to when the machine below them stops cooperating and the ground above them starts rising. He was holding on to the belief that someone on the ground was going to find a way. The clock ticked. 50 seconds. The AI diagnostic log on Emily's screen showed the cycle counter advancing. 40 seconds. Voss stood behind her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. 30 seconds. Emily Carter's hands were on the keyboard. Her face was very still. Whatever she was feeling, and she was feeling a great deal, all of it, contained all of it, controlled all of it, running very fast and very quiet beneath the surface. It did not show in the way that things you cannot afford to show do not show when you need them out to. 20 seconds. Ready on your mark, she said. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. The diagnostic window opened. Emily pressed send. And in the silence that followed, a silence so complete that the ventilation system suddenly seemed very loud, and the steady alarm tone from the telemetry feed suddenly seemed very far away. Everyone in that room waited to find out whether one young woman had just saved a man's life, or whether they had all just watched the last 4 seconds of their final option disappear. The main display flickered. The telemetry feed dropped. For exactly 3 seconds, there was nothing on the screen but static. And then somewhere above the Nevada desert, in a falling aircraft that had been spinning for 49 minutes, something changed. 3 seconds. That was how long the main display stayed dark. 3 seconds is not a long time in most situations. 3 seconds is how long it takes to pour a cup of coffee or read a short sentence or take a breath you were not planning to take. But in a command center where 12 engineers and 4 senior pilots and 1 young lieutenant were all staring at a screen that had just gone blank, while a man fell toward the Nevada desert in a spinning aircraft. 3 seconds was an eternity. 3 seconds was long enough for every person in that room to understand what it might mean if the screen did not come back. Voss did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing, directly behind Emily Carter, and he watched the dark screen with the expression of a man who has made a decision he is not yet sure was right and who will not allow himself the luxury of doubt until he knows the outcome. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was set. He was a statue made of 31 years of discipline and will. Garrett had turned away from the display, not because he couldn't watch, but because he was watching the behavioral log on the secondary screen, looking for any sign of data return, any flicker of system activity that would tell him what was happening inside the X-51's AI before the main telemetry came back. Mendez had her hand pressed flat against the edge of the console, and she did not appear to be aware that she had done it. Okafor was counting. His lips were barely moving, but he was counting, and anyone close enough to read his lips would have seen him at 2 when the main display came back. It did not come back all at once. It came back in sections the way a screen returns after a power interruption with different data feeds, reestablishing themselves in sequence altitude, first then airspeed, then the AI behavioral log, then the full telemetry cascade. And in the 2 seconds it took for all of that to resolve, the room was so quiet that the sound of Marcus Webb's keyboard was clearly audible across the space. Then the altitude readout appeared on screen. 28,400 feet. Descending. Still descending. Voss's expression did not change. But then the spin rate indicator resolved. And it was different. It was not the same number it had been for 49 minutes. It was not 62 degrees per second. It was not even close to 62 degrees per second. It was 11 degrees per second and dropping. Nobody said anything. Nobody said anything because saying something would require acknowledging what they were seeing, and acknowledging it would require believing it, and believing it would require accepting that the thing they were watching was actually happening, which it apparently was. The spin rate dropped to 8 degrees per second, then to 4, then to 1.7, then at 28,200 feet above the Nevada desert, the spin rate indicator on the main display read 0. The X-51 Phantom was no longer spinning. The room inhaled. It was not a cheer. It was not a celebration. It was the collective sound of 12 engineers and 4 senior pilots, releasing a breath that some of them had been holding in one form or another for 2 hours. And then Daniel Reeves's voice came through the speaker, and his voice was different from anything it had been in the past 49 minutes. Different from the controlled steadiness he had been maintaining, and different from the cold clarity he had moved into when he thought he might be running out of options, because now his voice had something in it that none of them had been sure they were going to hear. It had relief. Control, Reeves said, and there was a pause in that word. A pause that contained 49 minutes of a man holding himself together at altitude. My flight controls are responding. I have another pause shorter, the pause of a pilot who does not trust what he is seeing until he has verified it twice. I have positive control. The system is out of lockout. I'm flying. The room erupted. Not loudly. These were not people who erupted loudly, but the quality of the silence broke, and engineers spoke to each other in rapid technical sentences, and Mendez closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, and Okafor made a sound that was quiet and private and not intended for anyone else to hear. And Garrett turned from the secondary screen and looked at Emily Carter with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her career. Voss walked to the microphone. Reeves, he said, status. Aircraft is stable. I'm showing multiple system warnings, but primary flight controls are functional. I have altitude, I have airspeed, I have attitude. Colonel, I have the aircraft. Damage assessment. Running it now. A pause. Some hydraulic pressure loss in the secondary system. Landing gear indicators are showing a fault. I'll need to run extension checks before approach. But she's flying, sir. She's flying clean. Voss nodded once at the engineering team, who were already calculating approach parameters and runway configurations, and the dozens of other things that needed to be calculated when a damaged experimental aircraft was 60 miles out and needed to come home. Then he turned around. The room was moving again. People at their stations, the efficient, controlled activity of professionals who have passed through a crisis and are now managing its aftermath. But in the center of all that activity, Emily Carter was still standing at the console where she had sent the command. She had not moved. She was looking at the behavioral log as the AI system reestablished normal operating parameters, watching the data, the way she had been watching it for the past 22 minutes with the focused, quiet attention of someone who is still thinking even when the emergency is over. Voss walked up beside her. She looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a great deal between them in that silence. There was the moment 2 hours ago when she had first tried to speak and been dismissed. There was the moment 40 minutes ago when she had tried again and been told to return to her station. There was the moment 8 minutes ago when she had told him she already had the command built and the look on his face when he heard that. There was everything that had happened in the past 49 minutes that did not need to be said because it had already been demonstrated in numbers on a screen. "Good work, Lieutenant," Voss said. His voice was what it always was, even controlled, exactly calibrated to convey precisely what he intended and nothing more. But Emily Carter had spent enough time around people like Raymond Voss to understand that good work from a man like him was not a casual phrase. It was not the kind of thing he said to fill silence. When Raymond Voss said good work, he meant it the way a man means something he has examined carefully and decided is true. "Thank you, Colonel," Emily said. And then something happened that nobody in the room was expecting. Voss turned to face the room. Engineers at their stations, the communications team, Garrett and Mendez and Okafor, and he said in a voice that carried clearly across the space, "I want everyone in this room to understand what just happened. Lieutenant Carter identified a solution that the rest of us did not find. She identified it through careful observation of the data. She built a tool to execute it, while the rest of us were still looking for a different answer, and she was right. That is what excellence looks like. Remember it." He said it once. He did not repeat it. He turned back to the console and began reviewing the approach parameters for Reeves' return, because the crisis was over, but the work was not, and Raymond Voss did not linger in moments when there was still work to be done. But Emily heard it, and so did everyone else. What happened in the 30 minutes after that command was sent was in some ways more complicated than the 49 minutes that preceded it. Because when a crisis ends, when the immediate emergency resolves and the adrenaline begins to drain, and everyone in the room starts to process what just happened, human beings do not always respond in simple or straightforward ways. Some of them are grateful, some of them are relieved, and some of them, the ones who have been experts for a long time and who have just watched someone they underestimated do something they could not do, feel something more complicated than either of those things. Thomas Garrett was the first to approach her. He walked over while Voss was on the radio coordinating with Edwards Air Force Base, and he stood next to Emily at the console and he looked at the behavioral log she had been watching. 22 minutes, he said. "Yes," Emily said. "You saw it 22 minutes before you said anything." "I wasn't certain until about 14 minutes in," she said. "I wanted to verify the pattern before I brought it to anyone." Garrett nodded slowly. He was a careful man, and careful men take time to process things that disturb their understanding of a situation. "Why didn't you say something the first time when Voss dismissed you?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "I said what I could say at that point. I didn't have enough yet. If I'd pushed harder before I had the command built, I would have just been another voice in the room without a solution." "So you went back to your station and kept working?" "Yes." "While we were running the override sequence for the 6th time?" "Yes." Garrett looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing something. "You should have pushed harder," he said finally. "Even without the command ready, you should have been louder." Emily met his gaze. "Would it have helped, Major?" A pause. "No," Garrett said honestly. "Probably not." He looked back at the screen. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't have tried." "I did try. I was told to return to my station." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," Garrett said, "you were." He seemed about to say something else. Then he stopped. Then he said, "Good work, Carter. I mean that." "Thank you, sir." He walked away. And Emily turned back to the console and kept working because the aircraft was still 60 miles out and the work was not done. And she was not the kind of person who stopped when there was still something to be done. Sarah Mendez came over 12 minutes later while the engineering team was running landing gear simulations for Reeves' approach. Mendez was different from Garrett. Where Garrett was careful and deliberate, Mendez was fast and direct. And when she had something to say, she said it without spending a lot of time deciding how to say it. I owe you an apology, Mendez said. Emily looked up. Ma'am, when you first spoke up, I gave you a neutral look and didn't back you up. I should have. Saw the same data you did, and I didn't see what you saw. And when you said something, I didn't step in to give you room. I want to acknowledge that. Emily was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that. Don't misunderstand me, Mendez said. I'm not apologizing because you were right. I would say the same thing if you'd been wrong and had a good idea that was worth exploring. People in this room should have more room to speak than they sometimes get. That's a problem, and your situation today was an example of it. Yes, ma'am. Mendez looked at the console for a moment. Can I ask you something off the record? Of course. How long did you know? Emily considered the question. I had a hypothesis at about the 14-minute mark, she said carefully. I knew enough to be worth listening to at about 20 minutes. I had the command ready at 22, and you waited. I tried once at about the 20-minute mark. I was told to return to my station. Mendez was quiet. And then you tried again. At about 45 minutes, yes, when the options were running out. Did you know they would listen the second time? Emily looked at her directly. No, she said, but I knew that if I waited until they had no options left, I would at least get heard. And if I got heard, I could show them what I had. At that point, whether they believed me it was out of my control. The only thing I could control was making sure the solution was ready when I got the chance to present it. Mendez studied her for a long moment. That is either very wise or very cold-blooded, she said. I hope it was wise, Emily said. I was too scared to be cold-blooded. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, something crossed Sarah Mendez's face that was close to a smile. Fair enough, she said. She straightened up. Your recovery method is going to be written up as an incident report. You should know that. The investigators are going to want to talk to you. I know. They're going to ask questions about why you waited to present the solution. I know that too. What are you going to tell them? Emily thought about it for a moment. The truth, she said. I'm going to tell them the truth and let them decide what they think about it. Mendez nodded once, and there was something in that nod that was not entirely simple, that had layers in it: approval, and something more complicated than approval, something that had to do with things that women in rooms like this one understood about each other that they did not always have the words to explain. Then she walked away. The approach took 40 minutes from authorization to wheels down, 40 minutes during which the engineering team at Edwards Air Force Base and the engineering team in the Underground Command Center worked in parallel to establish the safest possible landing configuration for an aircraft that had multiple system warnings, a secondary hydraulic fault and landing gear indicators that were showing a fault that might mean the gear would extend and might mean it would not. Emily worked through all 40 of those minutes. She had moved from the center console back to her secondary station, and she was monitoring the AI behavioral log as the system continued to reestablish its normal operating parameters, watching for any sign that the defensive lockout might reassert itself, watching for any anomaly that might indicate the X-51's AI was not as stable as the telemetry suggested. It was during those 40 minutes that she became aware of something she had not been paying attention to during the crisis. Because during the crisis, there had been no bandwidth to pay attention to anything other than the problem. People were watching her. Not all of them, and not obviously, but she could feel it in the way the room had reorganized itself slightly around her secondary station, in the way conversations that were happening near her would pause when she moved, in the way certain engineers who had not looked in her direction during 2 hours of crisis were now finding reasons to be near her monitoring station. She did not acknowledge it. She kept working. But she felt it. She felt it in the complicated way that people feel attention when they are not sure yet whether the attention is good or bad, when the outcome is still being determined and the story of what happened is still being written by the people who are going to write it. Because Emily Carter was 29 years old and she was not naive. She understood that solving a problem in a room full of people who did not expect her to solve it was not the same thing as being celebrated for solving it. She understood that the story of what had happened in the past 2 hours was going to be told many times by many different people, and that the version of the story that survived was not necessarily going to be the version that was most accurate. She had been in enough rooms like this one to know that. She kept working. Reeves landed at Edwards at 14:47 local time. The gear extended on the third attempt, which meant it had not extended on the first 2 attempts, which meant that for approximately 90 seconds during final approach, There had been a genuine possibility that Captain Daniel Reeves was going to land a damaged experimental aircraft with no landing gear. The engineers at Edwards had a foam runway procedure ready, and Reeves himself had been through foam landing simulations 3 times during his career, and there was a plan, and everyone was following the plan. But the gear came down on the 3rd attempt, and the plan for the foam runway was not needed, and Reeves touched down at Edwards Air Force Base at 1447 with landing gear deployed and flight controls functional, and all 3 of his primary flight systems operating within acceptable parameters for a damaged aircraft. He taxied to the emergency stop point, and the aircraft went still. In the underground command center 60 miles away, the room exhaled for the 2nd time that afternoon. Emily Carter looked at the display that showed the aircraft on the ground stationary with the emergency vehicles surrounding it. She looked at it for exactly the length of time it took to understand that the aircraft was down and the pilot was alive, and the thing that had needed to happen had happened. Then she looked at the behavioral log one more time, verified that the AI system was stable, and began closing out her monitoring station. She was logging the session data when Okafor appeared beside her. Frederick Okafor was the quietest of the 4 senior pilots. He was careful with words in the way that some people are careful with money, spending them deliberately, not wasting them on things that didn't require them. He had said very little during the crisis. His contribution had been the mathematical analysis of control input combinations work that had been thorough and correct, and that had ultimately not provided the answer. He had said nothing when Emily first spoke up. He had said nothing when Voss dismissed her. He had said nothing when she came back with the command ready, other than asking what could be accomplished in 4.2 seconds. He stood beside her now and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The diagnostic window, how did you find it?" Emily looked up. It was in the behavioral log. It was visible in the data. "I looked at that log," Okafor said, 4 times. I didn't see it." "I know," Emily said carefully. "I want to understand why I didn't see it." She considered how to answer. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was thinking about how to say the answer in a way that was accurate without being something that sounded like it was designed to wound, because she did not want to wound Frederick Okafor, and she did not think he deserved to be wounded. She thought he was asking the question genuinely, and genuine questions deserve genuine answers. "You were looking at the log for something that would tell you how to take control," she said. "A command pathway and input that the system might accept. You were scanning for evidence of a vulnerability you could exploit." "Yes," Okafor said, "that's correct. I was looking at it differently. I was watching how the AI was behaving, not what it was doing. The diagnostic window doesn't look like a vulnerability. It looks like a system process. If you're scanning for pathways, you would filter past it because it doesn't match the pattern you're looking for." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "And you weren't scanning for pathways?" "No, I was watching the system think." Another pause. "That's a different skill," he said. "Yes, it's a skill I should have." Emily looked at him. "You have a lot of skills I don't have, Major." "Today that's not enough," he said simply. It was not self-pity. It was the honest statement of a precise man who had performed a precise calculation and arrived at a result he did not like, but was willing to accept. He looked at the closed-out monitoring station. "Your recovery method is going to change the emergency procedure tree. You know that." "I don't know that," Emily said honestly. "It will," Okafor said. "They'll argue about it first. The investigators will write their report, and the senior staff will review it, and then they'll argue about it for a while because that's what happens when a procedure changes. But eventually it will be in the tree, and when it is, it'll have your name on it." Emily did not say anything. "You should know that," Okafor said. "Whatever happens in the next few weeks, whatever the investigators say or don't say, whatever gets written in the reports, what you did today will be in the procedure tree. That's what actually matters." He paused. "That's what actually lasts." He walked away. Emily finished logging the session data. She was almost done when the door to the command center opened and Commander Michael Harris walked in. Harris was not someone Emily saw often. He was 3 levels above her in the chain of command, the kind of person who appeared at critical incident briefings and program review meetings, and not usually in the middle of an active emergency. His presence in the command center now 40 minutes after the aircraft had landed meant something. Voss looked up when Harris entered. Something passed between them in that look that Emily could not entirely read, but that felt like a conversation that had already been had somewhere else that was now continuing in a room that had not been part of its beginning. Colonel Harris said. Commander Voss said, "As you can see, the aircraft is on the ground. Captain Reeves is being evaluated by the medical team at Edwards. Preliminary indication is that he's uninjured." "I've been briefed," Harris said. He looked at the room at the engineers at their stations at Garrett and Mendez in Okafor, and then his gaze moved to the secondary monitoring station where Emily Carter was finishing her log. He walked over. Emily stood up straight. "Lieutenant Carter," Harris said. "Commander." Harris looked at her for a moment with the assessing, careful look of a man who has heard something about a person and is now comparing that information to what he is seeing with his own eyes. It was not an unfriendly look, but it was not a simple look either. "Walk me through what you did," he said. So Emily walked him through it. She walked him through the moment she identified the behavioral pattern in the AI log, through the process of verifying the diagnostic window, through the decision to build the inverse flag command, while the senior pilots continued working on the override sequence. She walked him through the moment she had first spoken and been dismissed, and she said it factually without editorial, the way you describe a thing that happened, because it is part of the record, and the record needs to be accurate. Harris listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you push harder when you were initially dismissed?" Emily had been expecting the question. "Because I didn't have the solution ready yet," she said. "I had a hypothesis. A hypothesis without a working implementation isn't a recovery procedure. If I had pushed harder at 20 minutes and Colonel Voss had given me time to present a hypothesis that I couldn't yet execute, I would have used up the room's willingness to listen without giving them something actionable. I made the decision to keep working until I had something concrete. And if you hadn't gotten a second opportunity, then I would have requested an urgent audience through official channels and accepted whatever response I received," Emily said. "I didn't have the authority to override Colonel Voss's decisions about how to manage the recovery operation. I still don't. I had a solution and I needed to wait for the right moment to present it." Harris studied her. "Some people would say you waited too long." "Some people might be right," Emily said. "If the aircraft had been lower when I got the second opportunity, the outcome might have been different. That's something I've been thinking about. And I think I made the best decision I could with the information I had at each moment. I don't know if it was the perfect decision. I don't know if there was a perfect decision. There wasn't time to find one." Harris nodded slowly. He looked at her for another moment. "The incident report is going to be thorough," he said. "Your decisions are going to be reviewed in detail. Not just your technical decision, but the procedural ones. How you managed your communication with the senior recovery team." "I understand. The review is going to surface some questions that are uncomfortable." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" Emily looked at him directly. "Commander, I've been in rooms like this one long enough to know that when the person with the solution is the person nobody expected to have it, the review afterward is never straightforward. I'm prepared for it. I'd rather be reviewed thoroughly than have the questions unanswered." Harris was quiet for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You know what the most remarkable thing about today was?" Emily waited. "Not the technical solution," Harris said. "The technical solution was brilliant, and it's going to matter, and it's going to be in the procedure tree within 18 months, I'll promise you that. But the most remarkable thing was that you stayed in that room for 2 hours doing work that nobody was asking you to do, solving a problem that nobody had assigned to you, and you did it quietly without demanding recognition, without the assurance that anyone was going to listen when you were ready. You just kept working." Emily did not say anything. "That's rarer than the technical insight," Harris said. "In my experience, it's rarer than almost anything." He looked at the main display one more time, where the data from the landed aircraft was still scrolling across the screen in the steady, organized way that data scrolls when the emergency is over and the systems are stable, and everything that was supposed to happen has happened. Then he said, "Well done, Lieutenant," and walked away. Emily turned back to her console. She finished the log entry. She verified the behavioral data one final time. She checked the AI stability parameters against the baseline readings from before the software failure, noted the discrepancies that the engineering team would need to address before the X-51 flew again, and added those observations to the session notes. She did all of that in the same quiet, focused way she had done everything else in the past 2 hours and 20 minutes. And when she was done, She sat back in her chair for the first time since the emergency had begun, and she let out a slow, steady breath, and she allowed herself for exactly a moment to feel the full weight of what the afternoon had been. Not the triumph of it, not the professional satisfaction of a problem solved under pressure. Not even the relief of knowing that a pilot who had 2 children and 38 years of living was going to go home tonight. Just the weight of it. Just the reality of what it meant to sit in a room where nobody thought you had the answer, and to hold the answer quietly, and to wait and to be ready when the moment came. She sat with that for exactly one moment. Then she picked up her tablet and started reviewing the AI behavioral log from the beginning because she had questions about the software failure that had triggered the lockout in the first place. Questions that the session data might answer if she looked at it carefully enough, and answers that the engineering team was going to need before this aircraft flew again. She was still reading when the last engineer left the command center at the end of the shift. She was still reading when the overnight team came in to begin their work. Nobody asked her why she was still there. Nobody needed to. Part 3, the cost of being right. She was still at her station at 11:47 p.m. when Daniel Reeves walked into the command center. Nobody had told her he was coming. Nobody had told her much of anything in the 6 hours since the aircraft had landed, which was itself a kind of information. The silence that follows a crisis is rarely neutral, and Emily Carter was experienced enough to understand that the quality of the silence around her had been shifting since Harris walked out of the room. The overnight engineering team had arrived, settled in, begun their work, and treated her with the careful, slightly uncertain courtesy that people extend to someone whose status in a situation is not entirely clear to them. She heard the door open. She heard footsteps. She heard the overnight lead engineer say something quiet and then go back to his work. And she heard the footsteps continue crossing the room toward her station, and she knew without looking up who was making them. She looked up anyway. Daniel Reeves was 38 years old, and he looked every year of it right now. The flight suit was replaced by a standard uniform, the kind they give you at the base medical facility when they take your flight gear for post-incident inspection. His face had the specific look of a man who has spent 6 hours being examined by doctors, who kept finding new things to check, and who kept saying just to be thorough, in the tone that means they were finding things they wanted to look at more carefully. There was a small bandage on his left hand that hadn't been there this morning. His eyes were clear and steady and completely present, the eyes of a man who has had a very long day and has thought about it enough to arrive somewhere on the other side of it. He stopped in front of her station. Emily stood up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a lot in that moment. There was 49 minutes of a man in a spinning aircraft and a woman in a command center who were in the same crisis from different ends of it, separated by 60 miles and 40,000 feet, and who had never met before today. "Lieutenant Carter," Reeves said. "Captain Reeves," Emily said. "How are you?" He looked at her steadily. "I asked the medical team to let me come here before I went back to base housing," he said. "They said they'd clear it if I made it short. So I'll make it short." He paused. "I wanted to say it to your face. Not over a radio, not in a report, not through someone else. To your face." Emily waited. "Thank you," Reeves said. "My son is 10. My daughter is 7. I was thinking about them when your command came through. I want you to know that." Emily did not trust herself to speak for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "I'm glad you're on the ground, Captain." "So am I," he said. And then something shifted in his face, something that was not exactly a smile but was adjacent to one, the expression of a man who is still processing the day and finding that some parts of it are easier to process than others. "I heard Voss dismissed you the first time." "That's accurate." "And you went back to your station and kept working." "Yes." "Why did that happen?" he asked. "And I want to understand that. Why didn't you—" He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Why didn't you push harder? You had the solution. You knew you had something." Emily thought about how to answer this honestly. She had given Harris a procedural answer, a professional answer about timing and implementation, and the appropriate use of limited opportunities to be heard. She looked at Daniel Reeves, at the bandage on his hand, at the eyes that had been watching altitude indicators drop for 49 minutes, and she decided that he deserved a different answer. "Because being right isn't enough," she said. "Being right in a room where you don't have authority only matters if the people with authority are willing to hear you. And people with authority become willing to hear you when the options they trust have run out. If I had pushed harder at minute 20, I would have used up the room's patience before my solution was ready, and I might have lost my second chance before I had anything to show. So I waited until I had something real, and I waited until there was space to show it. Reeves was quiet for a moment. That's a cold thing to have to calculate, he said. Yes, Emily said simply. It was. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, Voss told me what he said to the room after. He didn't have to do that. No, Reeves agreed. He didn't. That's why it matters. He straightened slightly. I don't know what the review is going to look like. I've been in this program long enough to know that incident reviews are never simple, and this one is going to be less simple than most. But I want you to know something that has nothing to do with the review and nothing to do with what anyone writes in a report. He looked at her directly. You understood something today that the foremost experienced pilots in this program didn't understand. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that changes how people fly. Don't let the process make you small. Whatever happens in the next few weeks, don't let it make you small. Emily held his gaze. I'll try, she said. Good. He nodded once. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. You've been here long enough. He turned and walked back across the room and out through the door, and the overnight team went back to their work, and Emily stood at her station for a moment after he left with the particular quiet of someone who has just been given something they did not know they needed until they received it. Then she sat back down and returned to the AI behavioral log. Because the aircraft was still grounded, and the question of what had caused the software failure in the first place was still unanswered, and answers to that question were going to matter, and someone needed to find them. The formal incident review began 9 days later. 9 days during which Emily Carter had filed her session log, submitted her technical notes on the AI behavioral patterns she had observed, completed the written documentation of the inverse flag command and the methodology behind it, and attended 3 preliminary meetings with the engineering team to walk through the technical details of what she had done and why she had done it. 9 days during which she had continued her regular duties, had eaten in the base cafeteria at normal hours, had run her standard morning route, had called her mother in Tucson on Sunday evening, the way she always did, and had said nothing to her mother about what had happened because her mother did not have clearance and because some things you carry quietly until you have somewhere appropriate to put them. 9 days during which she had noticed with the careful attention she applied to most things that the way people spoke to her had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that were obvious or documentable, but in the small daily transactional ways that add up to something over time, the way certain people in the program who had barely acknowledged her before now made eye contact, the way certain conversations stopped and restarted when she walked into a room, the way her name appeared in emails where it had not appeared before. She noted all of it. She did not react to any of it. She waited. The Incident Review Board convened at 0800 on a Thursday morning in a conference room 2 levels above the underground command center. The board consisted of 5 people, Commander Harris, who chaired it, Colonel Josephine Akers from the Program Oversight Office, who Emily had met once and who had the reputation of being meticulous to the point of being painful, Major David Lynn from Flight Safety, who specialized in human factors in aircraft incidents, a senior engineer named Patricia Rowe from the AI Systems Division, who had been flown in from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base specifically for this review, and Colonel Raymond Voss. Emily was not on the board. She was the subject of a portion of the review. She was called in at 10:23 a.m. The 5 board members were arranged on one side of the conference table when she entered. She sat across from them in the chair that had been placed for her, set her tablet on the table, and waited. Harris opened. Lieutenant Carter, this review covers the events of October 14th from 0600 hours, when the X-51 software anomaly was first detected, through 1447 hours, when the aircraft landed at Edwards Air Force Base. The board has reviewed your session log, your technical documentation, and the initial statements provided by the other personnel present in the command center. We have questions about your actions during the incident. I want to be clear that this review is not a disciplinary proceeding. It is an analysis of what occurred for the purpose of improving protocols and procedures. You should answer all questions directly and completely. Understood, Commander, Emily said. Colonel Akers spoke first. Lieutenant Carter, your primary assigned role during the October 14th operation was Systems Observer. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. Can you describe what a systems observer is responsible for? Monitoring secondary system parameters and logging anomalies for post-incident analysis. Providing technical support to the primary engineering team on request. On request, Akers said, you were not assigned to the primary recovery operation. No, ma'am. But you took actions that directly affected the recovery operation. Yes, ma'am. Walk me through the decision to begin developing the inverse flag command while the primary recovery team was still working the override sequence. Emily walked her through it. She was precise. She used the language of the technical documentation because this was a board that understood that language, and she did not simplify or editorialize, and she answered the questions that were asked without volunteering information that had not been requested because she had learned early in her career that the most dangerous thing you can do in a formal review is give people information they have not asked for and allow them to construct their own interpretation of it. Akers listened. Then she said, at the point when you began developing the command, you had not yet notified the senior recovery team of what you were observing. I had made one attempt to present my observations, Emily said. I was directed to return to my station. By Colonel Voss. Yes, ma'am. And you complied. Yes, ma'am. But you continued developing the command. Yes, ma'am. Why mounting? Akers said, and her voice was not aggressive, but it was precise in the way that made clear she wanted a precise answer. Because the instruction I received was to return to my station. There was no instruction to cease working the problem. My role as systems observer includes monitoring for anomalies and documenting observations. What I was doing was consistent with that role. Akers looked at her for a moment. That is a careful answer, Lieutenant. It is an accurate answer, Colonel. A brief silence. Major Lynn leaned forward. Lieutenant Carter, I want to ask you about the decision-making process. When Colonel Voss directed you to return to your station, what did you believe was the most likely outcome if you complied completely, stopped working the problem, and waited for the senior team to resolve it? Emily considered the question. Based on what I had observed of the AI behavioral pattern by that point, I believe the override sequence being run by the primary team would continue to fail. I believed the aircraft would reach ejection threshold before the primary team found a solution. So you believe Captain Reeves was going to have to eject? I believe that was the likely outcome in the absence of a different approach, yes. And you had a different approach. I had the beginning of one. I needed about 8 more minutes of development time before I could be confident it would work. And you used those 8 minutes. Yes. Wynn sat back. I want to be direct with you about something, he said. Part of what this board is trying to understand is whether your decision to continue working the problem without explicit authorization from Colonel Voss represents a procedural violation or a reasonable exercise of judgment under time pressure. Can you help us understand how you thought about that at the time? This was the question Emily had known was coming. She had known it was coming since Harris first told her the review would be thorough. She had thought about how to answer it for 9 days. I thought about it as a question of priorities, she said. Procedure exists to serve outcomes. The outcome we were all trying to achieve was to get Captain Reeves on the ground safely. I had information that was relevant to that outcome. The procedure for presenting that information had been interrupted. I made a judgment call to continue developing the information so that it would be ready when the opportunity to present it recurred rather than abandoning the work because the first opportunity had been foreclosed. You prioritize the outcome over the procedure, Akers said. I prioritize the outcome while remaining within the boundaries of my assigned role, Emily said. Systems observers monitor and document. That is what I was doing. Until you presented the command to Colonel Voss. Yes. At which point you were acting outside your assigned role. Emily held Akers' gaze. At which point I was presenting a potential solution to the designated decision-maker and allowing him to determine whether to implement it. Colonel Voss made that decision. I provided the option. There was a silence. Then Patricia Rowe, the AI systems engineer from Wright-Patterson, who had not spoken yet, said, Lieutenant Carter, I want to ask you something technical. The inverse flag command you developed, you wrote it from memory of the AI system architecture documentation. From memory and from the behavioral log I was observing, Emily said. I needed the live data to calibrate the specific flag parameters. The architecture knowledge was background. How long had you been studying the X-51's AI system architecture? Emily thought about this. Seriously, about 14 months. I first accessed the design documentation when I was assigned to the observer role, but I went considerably deeper into the system documentation over the following year because the AI architecture was the most technically interesting aspect of the program to me. 14 months of independent study, Rose said. That wasn't a sign. No, it was personal interest. Rowe looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than the others. The inverse flag command you wrote, she said, has been reviewed by my team at Wright-Patterson over the past 9 days. I want to tell you what they found. Emily waited. They found that your command was not just functional, Rose said. It was elegant. It used the minimum possible system resources to achieve the flag reversal, which is significant because during the diagnostic window, excess resource usage can cause the window to close prematurely. A less precisely written command might have worked partially or not at all. Yours worked completely. My team spent 14 months building the X-51's AI architecture. You reverse engineered a recovery pathway in 22 minutes of observation. The room was quiet. I don't tell you that to be flattering, Rowe added. I tell you because this board needs to understand the technical context of what happened. What Lieutenant Carter did on October 14th was not a lucky guess. It was the application of deep, self-directed technical knowledge under extreme time pressure. That context matters for how this board evaluates her decisions. Harris nodded slowly. He looked at Emily. Lieutenant Carter, I have one more question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer it. Yes, Commander. If you were in the same situation again, same room, same crisis, same dynamic, would you do anything differently? This was the question Emily had spent the most time with. Not the procedural questions, not the technical questions, not the questions about authority and role definition in the correct chain of communication. This one. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. Harris raised an eyebrow slightly. Tell me. I would speak up sooner, she said. Not at 20 minutes. At 14 minutes when I first identified the pattern. Even without the command ready. Because I was calculating whether I would be heard, and I was calculating whether having something complete would make the message land better, and both of those calculations were probably right. But a pilot was falling, and 14 minutes is 14 minutes. If I had spoken at 14 and been dismissed, I would have had more time to push back before the window closed. I made the right technical decision. I'm not certain I made the right human decision. The room was very still. And what would you say to the board member who might argue, Harris said carefully, that speaking at 14 minutes without a ready solution would have simply extended the period of dismissal and reduced your credibility when you returned at 45? I would say they might be right, Emily said. And I would say that both things can be true at the same time. That I made a decision that was strategically defensible and humanly imperfect. And that living with the imperfect part is something I am going to do regardless of what this board concludes. Silence. Harris looked at the board members on either side of him. He looked at Voss, who had not asked a single question during the entire session, and who was looking at Emily with the expression of a man who was finishing a thought that began 9 days ago in an underground command center when he said good work and meant more than the words carried. Colonel Voss, Harris said, do you have questions for Lieutenant Carter? Voss looked at Harris, then he looked at Emily. No, he said, I don't have questions. He paused. I have a statement if the board will allow it. Go ahead, Harris said. Voss was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was choosing words, measuring them, deciding which ones were worth spending. I dismissed Lieutenant Carter's first attempt to contribute because I assessed her as a junior systems observer whose input was unlikely to exceed what the primary recovery team was generating. That assessment was wrong. He did not look away from Emily while he said this. I was wrong, and my error cost us approximately 25 minutes of time that we could have been developing the solution Lieutenant Carter had already identified. In a situation with a different altitude margin, the 25 minutes might have been the difference between a pilot on the ground and a pilot who wasn't. I want that on the record. The room was very still. Emily looked at Raymond Voss and saw something in his face that she had not expected to see there, something that had cost him something to put there. Because Raymond Voss was a man for whom being wrong was not a casual event. He was a man who had built 31 years on being right, on having the answer, on being the one in the room who knew what to do. What he had just said was not a small thing for a man like that to say, and it had not been a small thing for him to say it in front of 5 people and in a formal record. She did not say anything. She held his gaze and she nodded once, and she let the moment be what it was. Harris formally closed her portion of the review at 12:04 p.m. Emily gathered her tablet, thanked the board, and left the room. She was in the hallway outside approximately 30 seconds after the door closed behind her when the weight of the morning arrived. Not dramatically. She did not break down. She did not lean against the wall or close her eyes or make any of the outward signs of a person being hit by something they had been holding at a distance. She walked to the end of the hallway and stood at the window that looked out over the base, and she breathed 3 slow breaths, and she let the weight move through her and settle into the place where she was going to carry it. Because she knew the review was not over. This was her session. The board was going to spend the rest of the day discussing what they had heard, reviewing the documentation, writing their preliminary conclusions. And the preliminary conclusions were going to drive a set of recommendations, and those recommendations were going to either support or challenge the procedural decision she had made, and the outcome of that process was going to affect her career in ways she could not fully predict. She knew all of that. She breathed 3 slow breaths, and she straightened her shoulders and walked to the cafeteria to get lunch. She was eating alone at a corner table when Garrett sat down across from her. She looked up. She had not seen Garrett in 6 of the 9 days since the incident. He had not been at any of the preliminary technical meetings. His name had not appeared in any of the emails she had received. The absence had been notable enough that she had noticed it and chosen not to interpret it, because interpreting things you don't have data on is a reliable way to arrive at wrong conclusions. Thomas, she said. She used his first name because they were not in a formal setting and because the morning had been formal enough. How did it go? He said. It was a thorough review, she said. Acres is thorough, he agreed. He looked at the table for a moment. I was called in this morning before you, early session. They asked me about the override sequence, about why we kept running it after it became clear it wasn't working. Emily was quiet. I told them the truth, Garrett said, that we kept running it because we were confident that if we adjusted the parameters correctly, we would find a pathway. That we kept running it because that was the correct procedure for a flight control failure, and we were following the correct procedure, and that the correct procedure was wrong for this particular failure mode. He paused. I also told them that when you first spoke up, I should have backed you. Emily looked at him. I didn't the first time, he said. I gave you neutral. I gave you, we've had 4 senior pilots and we would have caught it. And that was not backing you. That was managing you. And I told the board that. Tom, let me finish, I said. I'm not telling you this because I want recognition for honesty in a formal review. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that when the record is written, it will say that I did not back you when I should have. Not because you need my validation. Because you should know what people said when they weren't managing the situation. Emily was quiet for a moment. What did Voss say in his session? Garrett looked at her. Voss said more than I expected him to say. He said something in my session, Emily said. He said his assessment of me was wrong. He said more than that in his. Garrett's voice was careful. He said the program needs to examine the conditions under which junior personnel are dismissed in high-pressure environments. He said today was not the first time that dismissal might have cost the program something, just the first time the cost was immediately visible. He paused. That was not easy for Voss to say. I know, Emily said quietly. He's a difficult man, Garrett said. He is also in the ways that matter a good one. He looked at her directly. Whatever the board recommends your work on October 14th is not going to be quietly filed and forgotten. Patricia Rowe's technical assessment of the command you wrote went to 3 separate engineering teams last week. All 3 of them want to talk to you. The program is already changing because of what you did. The review is a formality at this point, a necessary one, but a formality. Emily took that in. Why are you telling me this now? Garrett was quiet for a moment. Because you spent 9 days being careful and contained and professional, and you've earned the right to know that it worked. That the careful, contained, professional thing you've been doing since October 14th has been seen by the people who needed to see it. He looked at his hands. And because I sat in that room for 2 hours on October 14th, and I was good at my job, and I still couldn't find what you found, and I am still 9 days later trying to understand what that means. He looked up. And that's the kind of thing a man needs to admit out loud to someone, or it sits in him wrong. Emily looked at Thomas Garrett, who was one of the best pilots in the program, and who was sitting across a cafeteria table from her, telling her something true at a cost that was real and that she respected. I think, she said carefully, that what it means is that being good at one kind of seeing doesn't mean you're good at all kinds of seeing, and that the program needs both kinds, and that neither of us can do this alone. Garrett held her gaze. That's a generous interpretation, he said. It's an accurate one, she said. And I'm going to need people like you in my corner when the next hard thing comes. So I'd rather it be accurate. Something shifted in Garrett's expression, not dramatically, but visibly. Fair enough, he said. He stood up, picked up his tray, and then stopped. The board is going to issue preliminary findings Friday morning, he said. Harris told me before I left the session. I don't know what they'll say, but I know Rowe's technical assessment is already in the record, and Voss's statement is already in the record, and what you said this morning is already in the record. Whatever Friday looks like, those things are in the record. He walked away. Emily sat at the corner table for another 15 minutes after he left, finishing her lunch with the same steady, unhurried attention she brought to everything. And she thought about what Reeves had said to her in the command center the night of the incident. The thing that had not been procedural or professional or calibrated, the thing that had come from a man who wanted to say something true to the person who deserved to hear it. Don't let the process make you small, she thought about it. Then she finished her lunch, cleared her tray, and went back to work. The board's preliminary findings came out on Friday morning at 0900, exactly when Harris had said they would. Emily was at her regular station when the document hit her inbox. She had been there since 0645, working through the AI behavioral analysis she had started the night of the incident and had been building steadily since, adding layers of data interpretation each day as the engineering team at Wright-Patterson sent her additional system logs from the X-51's pre-flight diagnostics. The work was absorbing in the way that genuinely important work is absorbing, not because it distracted her from what was coming, but because it was real and it mattered, and it gave her something to put her hands on while she waited. She saw the notification appear in the corner of her screen at 0901. She finished the paragraph of analysis she was writing. Then she opened the document. It was 11 pages long. Formal incident review documents from program-level boards are always longer than they need to be, filled with procedural language and citation frameworks in the specific vocabulary that investigations use to describe events in ways that are accurate without being inflammatory. Emily had read enough of them to know how to navigate the structure, how to find the conclusions without reading every clause of every finding, how to identify what the board actually decided underneath the language they used to say it. She found the section on her actions on page 7. She read it once carefully. Then she set her tablet down and sat very still for approximately 20 seconds. Then she picked the tablet back up and read it again, more slowly this time, making sure she had understood what she thought she had understood. The board had found that her technical actions on October 14th were consistent with her assigned role and represented an appropriate exercise of judgment under time pressure. The inverse flag command was characterized as a significant technical contribution that demonstrated deep independent knowledge of the X-51 AI system architecture. Her decision to continue developing the command after being directed to return to her station was found to be within the boundaries of her systems observer responsibilities. Her decision to present the command to Colonel Voss when she did was found to be timely given the aircraft's remaining altitude margin. Those were the findings about what she had done. Then there was a second section. The second section was about what the program had done. The board found that the command center protocols for the October 14th operation did not adequately account for the possibility that a junior systems observer might possess specialized knowledge relevant to a primary recovery operation. The protocol assumed a clear functional boundary between the primary recovery team and the observer role. That boundary, while appropriate for normal operations, created conditions in which potentially critical information was delayed in reaching the decision maker by an estimated 25 minutes. The board recommended a review of command center protocols to establish clearer pathways for junior personnel to contribute specialized knowledge during active recovery operations. Emily read that section 3 times. It was not about her being wrong, it was about the system being incomplete. She was still sitting with that when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Garrett and it said only page 7. Then a second message 30 seconds later told you. She put the phone down and looked at the AI behavioral analysis on her screen, the work she had been doing every morning for 9 days, and she understood something that she had known in an abstract way for most of her career, but that was now concrete and specific and real in a way it had not been before. The work was what lasted. Not the review, not the findings document, not even the moment in the command center when the screen came back and Reeves's voice came through the speaker. Those things were real and they mattered, but they were moments in moments past. What lasted was the work itself, the careful, accumulative, patient work of understanding something more deeply than it had been understood before, of building knowledge that could be used, of leaving a procedure tree better than you found it. She went back to her analysis. At 10:30, her phone rang. It was an internal number she didn't immediately recognize. She answered it. Lieutenant Carter. The voice was female, brisk, and familiar in the way that voices are familiar when you have heard them in formal settings, but not often enough to place immediately. Then she placed it. Colonel Josephine Akers. Colonel, Emily said. I'm calling because I want to say something that is not in the findings document, Akers said. Off the record. Do you have a moment? Yes, ma'am. The board's written findings say what they need to say, Akers said. What they don't say, because formal findings documents don't say these things, is that your conduct over the past 9 days was observed and noted. Not just October 14th, the 9 days after it, the way you handled the preliminary meetings, the way you documented your work, the way you answered questions in the review session this morning, or rather the way you answered them on Thursday morning. She paused. I've been doing program oversight for 11 years, Lieutenant. I have reviewed a great many incident reports. Most of the people who appear in them spend the review period either defending themselves aggressively or apologizing for things they should not apologize for. You did neither. You answered questions accurately, you acknowledged what you would do differently without diminishing what you had done, and you let the record speak for itself. I want you to know that it spoke clearly. Emily was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Colonel. I'm not calling to be kind, Akers said, and her voice was not unkind when she said it, just precise. I'm calling because there are going to be opportunities that come from this incident, and I want to make sure you are thinking clearly about them when they arrive. Patricia Rowe has already been in contact with Commander Harris about bringing you into the AI systems development consultation for the next software revision. That conversation is going to happen within the next 2 weeks. When it does, I want you to understand your position clearly. What is my position? Emily asked. Your position, Akers said, is that you are 29 years old and you have just contributed something that 3 engineering teams and 4 senior pilots could not. And you have done so under conditions that were not particularly supportive of your success. That is a strong position. Don't diminish it. Don't let anyone else diminish it either. Be direct about what you know and what you can contribute, and don't spend time managing how that sounds. A brief pause. That is advice I wish someone had given me at 29. It took me until 41 to figure it out on my own. Emily held the phone and felt the weight of what was being given to her, the specific kind of gift that experienced women sometimes give younger women when they have enough distance from their own difficult learning to put it into words. I'll remember that, Emily said. Good, Akers said. Congratulations on a thorough review, Lieutenant. Well handled. The call ended. Emily sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone. Then she set it down and went back to her analysis because there was still work to be done and the morning was not over. The meeting with Patricia Rowe happened 13 days later, not 2 weeks. It happened fast because Rowe was not a person who let things sit when she had decided they should move, and she had decided within 48 hours of reading Emily's technical documentation that the X-51 AI revision team needed a specific kind of input that currently no one on the team was providing, and that Emily Carter was the person to provide it. The meeting was not a job offer. It was a conversation, the kind of conversation that happens before a job offer when both parties are trying to determine whether the fit is real or just convenient. Rowe was direct about that. She sat across from Emily in a conference room at Edwards Air Force Base. Rowe had flown in from Wright-Patterson specifically for this, and she put her hands flat on the table and said, I want to understand something before we talk about anything procedural. On October 14th, you spent 14 months of independent study on a system that was not your primary assignment for no professional reason other than personal interest. That kind of investment in something outside your defined role is either the mark of someone who is going to be very useful or someone who is difficult to manage. I want to understand which one I'm dealing with. Emily looked at her. Can it be both, she said. Rose's expression did not change, but something in it shifted slightly. The almost invisible shift of someone encountering a response they had not expected. Explain, she said. The 14 months of study were driven by genuine interest in the system architecture, Emily said. That interest is not going to stop when I have a defined role that covers it. I will continue to be curious about things outside the boundaries of whatever assignment I'm given, and some of that curiosity will produce useful things, and some of it will just be curiosity. That makes me useful in ways that are hard to predict, which makes me somewhat difficult to manage by conventional metrics. She paused. What it does not make me is someone who takes unauthorized action without understanding the stakes. October 14th was a specific situation with a specific human cost attached to the decision. I made the call I made because I understood the cost. In a lower stakes situation, I follow procedure. Ro looked at her for a long moment. You know what the difference is between the people who just say that and the people who mean it? Tell me, Emily said. The people who mean it can tell you about a time they followed procedure when they thought procedure was wrong and the cost of following it was something they had to live with. Emily was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago, she said slowly, I was assigned as a systems monitor on a different program, an aircraft test run. I identified a potential anomaly in the fuel system telemetry that I thought warranted a hold. I reported it through proper channels. The decision came back as a no-hold. The flight proceeded. The anomaly did not develop into a failure, and the aircraft completed the mission successfully. She looked at her hands. I spent 2 weeks afterward going back through the telemetry trying to determine whether the anomaly had been real or whether I had misread the data. I concluded that it was real but within acceptable variance parameters, that I had been right to flag it, and that the decision to proceed had also been defensible. She looked up. I followed the procedure, I accepted the decision, and I lived with the uncertainty of not knowing for certain what would have happened if the decision had gone the other way. I still live with it. Ro held her gaze for a long moment. Then she said, good, that's the right answer. She uncapped a pen and opened the folder in front of her. Now let's talk about what the AI revision team actually needs and whether you can provide it. They talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was not the kind of conversation Emily had been in many times before. It had the quality of two technically precise people, finding the specific overlapping territory where their knowledge bases connected, testing the boundaries of what each of them understood, pushing on the edges to see where the knowledge was solid and where it became assumption. Ro was formidable. She had spent 14 months building the system that Emily had spent 14 months studying, and the conversation moved fast in the way that conversations move fast when both people know enough to skip the explanations and go directly to the hard questions. At the end of it, Ro closed her folder and said, I'm going to recommend you for a consulting role on the AI revision. It will require table reading on the new architecture documentation, which means your current assignment will need to accommodate the additional time commitment. That conversation will happen at the program level. I'm not in a position to manage your assignment structure, but I can tell Commander Harris what I need and make the case for why I need it. I understand, Emily said. I also want to tell you something, Rose said, and her voice shifted slightly, losing the precise clipped quality it had when she was in technical mode and moving towards something else. I've been building AI flight systems for 16 years. I have a team of 12 engineers who are very good at their jobs. None of them in 16 years has ever looked at a running AI behavioral log and written a recovery pathway in 22 minutes of observation. She paused. I don't say that to put pressure on you. I say it so you understand what you are. Because I suspect you have been in enough rooms where people underestimated you, that you have developed the habit of making yourself smaller than you are. I need you to stop doing that. I can work with someone who knows their limits. I cannot work with someone who hides their capabilities because they are afraid of how those capabilities land. Emily looked at her. Josephine Akers called me after your review session, Ro added. She said you answered every question directly and without apology. She said you acknowledged what you would do differently without diminishing what you had done. She looked at Emily steadily. I need you to do that in every meeting from here on. Not differently in my office than in Voss's office. The same. Consistently. I can do that, Emily said. Good, Rose said. She stood up and extended her hand. Welcome to the revision team, Lieutenant, provisionally. The formal approval will take approximately 3 weeks given program bureaucracy, but provisionally welcome. Emily shook her hand. She walked out of that conference room with the specific kind of quiet that comes after something significant has shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the deep structural way that things shift when the right door opens. It was 16:15 when she got back to her primary station. The base was winding down for the day, the particular late afternoon quality of a military facility where the day's formal business was concluding and the administrative machinery was slowing toward evening. She had 3 new emails, technical follow-up questions from one of the Wright-Patterson teams, a scheduling request from the Program Oversight Office, and one from an address she did not immediately recognize. She opened the unknown address last. The subject line said Marcus and Sophie's dad. She sat forward. The email was from Daniel Reeves, not from his official Air Force address, from a personal account, the kind you use when you want to say something that is not part of the official record. She had not heard from him since the night he had appeared in the command center with the bandage on his hand. The email was not long. It said, Lieutenant Carter, I told my kids what happened. Not the classified parts. The parts I could tell them. My son Marcus wanted to know if you were going to get a medal. My daughter Sophie wanted to know if you were a pilot. When I told her you were, she said, and I am quoting directly, because I want you to have this exactly, she said, Dad, the best pilots are the ones who know how the plane thinks. I thought you should have that. She is 7. I don't know how she knows these things. Thank you again. Reeves? Emily read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and let out a slow breath that had a great deal in it, a day's worth, a week's worth. 9 days of formal proceedings and review sessions and careful answers in the particular sustained effort of being professional when you were also underneath all of it, a person. She held the email on her screen for a long moment. Then she typed a reply. She wrote, Captain Reeves, tell Sophie she is correct and tell her the best pilots are also the ones who keep learning how. Thank you for this. Carter. She sent it. She closed the email and went back to her analysis. She was 40 minutes into it when the door to her section of the building opened and Colonel Raymond Voss walked in. She had not seen Voss since the review session on Thursday. She had not expected to see him today. He was not someone who appeared in sections of the building. He had no assigned reason to be in, and he had no assigned reason to be here. He walked to her station and stood beside it the way he had stood beside her at the center console on October 14th, directly without announcing himself, without the preliminary of small talk. Colonel, she said. Lieutenant. He looked at the analysis on her screen. The AI behavioral study. Yes, sir. Where are you in it? I've identified what I believe is the primary cause of the software failure that initiated the October 14th event, she said. There was a conflict between 2 subroutines in the sensor fusion layer that had never been triggered simultaneously in previous test flights because the specific combination of altitude, airspeed, and atmospheric conditions that triggers the conflict had never occurred before. On October 14th, it occurred for the first time. The AI interpreted the conflicting sensor data as physical damage to the aircraft and initiated the defensive lockout as a damage protection response. Voss looked at the screen. Have you submitted this to the engineering team? I'm completing the documentation today. It will go to Wright-Patterson tonight. Rowe knows she will by tomorrow morning. Voss nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the analysis with the focused attention he gave to things he was actually interested in, which was different from the polite attention he gave to things he was obligated to address. Yes. Emily had learned to distinguish between them. I've been thinking about something, Voss said, and his voice had the quality it got when he was saying something he had been carrying for a while and had decided to set down. Sir, she said, on October 14th, I told the room you had done good work, and I meant it. But I said it as a conclusion, as if the moment was finished. He paused. It wasn't finished. I knew that, and I said it like a conclusion anyway because... He stopped. He started again. Because acknowledging that a 29-year-old systems observer had found something that I had missed is not a comfortable thing. Not for a man who has built his career on not missing things. Emily said nothing. She was giving him the room he was asking for. The review, Voss said. My statement in the review about my assessment being wrong. He looked at her directly. That was not easy. I know, Emily said quietly. I want you to understand something about why I said it. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. I trained Daniel Reeves 12 years ago. He was a young lieutenant who thought he knew more than he did, and I spent the better part of a year taking that certainty apart and rebuilding it into something more reliable. And I was proud of that work. I was proud of what he became. He paused. When he was in that aircraft on October 14th, everything I did, every override attempt, every protocol run, it was for him. Not for the aircraft, for Daniel Reeves. He was quiet for a moment. And I almost got him killed because I was so certain I knew how to save him that I couldn't see the way you were seeing it. The room was very still. Colonel, Emily started. Let me finish, he said, not harshly. I'm not telling you this because I need absolution. I'm telling you because you deserve to understand the full picture of what happened in that room. You saw something I missed, not because you are smarter than I am, and not because you had better training. You saw it because you were looking at it from the outside without the weight of everything I was carrying about Daniel Reeves and 31 years of flying and what it means to be the one who is supposed to have the answer. You were lighter than I was, and that lightness was exactly what the problem needed. Emily looked at Raymond Voss, who had 31 years of certainty and was standing here taking it apart in front of her with the same precision and thoroughness he brought to everything because he was a man who believed that the work required accuracy above comfort, even when the subject of the accuracy was himself. I don't think it's lightness, she said carefully. I think it's a different kind of weight. I've spent my whole career in rooms where I was the least expected person to have the answer. That changes what you look for. When you know you're not the person everyone is going to listen to, you become very careful about what you bring when you finally get a chance to speak. You make sure it's real. You make sure it's right. You make sure it's ready. She paused. That's not lightness. That's a different kind of pressure. It just pushes in a different direction. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite any single emotion, but had elements of several, though complex expression of a man revising a framework he has held for a long time. You should have been in the primary recovery team, he said. Not as a systems observer, in the team. The protocol didn't support that, Emily said. The protocol is being revised, Voss said. The board's findings recommended it. Harris is going to begin the revision process next month. He paused. I will be leading the revision. Emily looked at him. And I want your input, he said informally, as part of the revision working group, not as an observer, as a contributor. He said it the way he said things he had decided, which was without preamble and without inflection, as if the decision was simply a fact that had been established and needed to be communicated. Emily held his gaze. I would be glad to contribute, Colonel. Good. He looked at the analysis on her screen one more time. Finish the documentation, get it to Rowe tonight. He straightened. And Carter. Sir, the diagnostic window you found, the 4.2-second cycle. He paused. I've been looking at the behavioral logs from the past 18 months of X-51 test flights. The window has been present in every flight. We have been flying past it for 18 months and never saw it. Emily was quiet. 18 months, he said again. It took you 22 minutes to find something we flew past for 18 months. He looked at her steadily. You asked the right question. Not a better question than the ones we were asking. A different one. The one the problem actually needed. He paused. The revision working group is going to need to understand how to ask different questions. That's what I need from you. He walked away. Emily turned back to her screen. She worked until 2015 that night, finishing the analysis documentation and preparing it for transmission to Wright-Patterson. The document was 43 pages. It included the identification of the sensor fusion conflict, the specific atmospheric conditions that had triggered it on October 14th, a probability analysis of future flights encountering the same conditions, and 3 proposed modifications to the AI subroutine architecture that would prevent the conflict from occurring again. On the last page, she added a section that had not been in her original outline. It was a short section, only 4 paragraphs, and it was about the diagnostic window, not about using it as a recovery tool, which was already documented, but about what the existence of the window revealed about the AI's underlying design philosophy. The window was there because the engineers who built the system had not wanted to create an AI that could not question itself. They had built in a moment every 93 seconds where the system stepped back from its own certainty and asked whether what it believed was still true. They had built that in deliberately, and none of them had ever imagined it would be the thing that saved a pilot's life. Emily wrote about that for 2 paragraphs. She wrote about the distance between what a tool is designed to do and what a tool is capable of doing, and about the importance of looking at systems not just for what they can be forced to do, but for what they are already trying to do. She wrote it for the engineering team at Wright-Patterson, but she also wrote it for herself. Because she had been in enough rooms and carried enough weight and waded through enough dismissals to understand that sometimes the most important capability a system has or a person has is the one that nobody thought to look for. The one that was there all along, cycling quietly in the background, waiting for someone to notice. She sent the document at 2019. Then she shut down her station, picked up her jacket, and walked out of the building into the Nevada evening, where the desert air was cold and clear, and the stars were doing what they always did, which was being exactly where they were supposed to be, enormous and indifferent and permanent, above the small human business of the day. She stood there for a moment, not long, just long enough to breathe. Then she walked to her car and drove back to base housing, and she called her mother in Tucson, and when her mother asked how her week had been, she said, "It was a long one, Mom, but I think it ended right." Her mother said, "Did you eat?" Emily laughed. It was a real laugh, the uncomplicated kind that happens when something is genuinely funny and when the person laughing has been serious for long enough that the release of it feels like something physical. "Yes," she said, "I ate." "Good," her mother said. "Then tell me about your week." And Emily Carter, who had found something in a behavioral log that 18 months of test flights had missed, who had built a command in 22 minutes that saved a man who was thinking about his children, who had sat in a formal review and answered every question without apology or diminishment, who had been told to be smaller than she was and had refused that instruction quietly and persistently, and without drama, leaned back in the driver's seat of her car in the Nevada dark and told her mother about her week. She did not tell her everything. Some of it was classified and some of it was not yet finished, and some of it was the kind of thing that needs more distance before it becomes a story you can tell. But she told her enough, and when she was done, her mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Emily, I am so proud of you." Emily closed her eyes. "I know, Mom," she said, "I know." The call from Commander Harris came on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after the incident review findings had been released. Emily was in the middle of her third session with the AI revision working group when her phone buzzed. She saw Harris's name on the screen and excused herself from the table quietly, the way she always excused herself from things without drama, without drawing the moment out, and stepped into the hallway. "Commander," she said. "Lieutenant Carter, are you available at Warrant 400 today?" "Yes, sir." "Good, my office. Bring your documentation on the sensor fusion analysis." He hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment, phone still in her hand, and did the particular kind of rapid calculation that she had become accustomed to doing in recent weeks, reading the information she had been given against the information she did not have, trying to understand the shape of what was coming before it arrived. Harris did not call people to his office at 1400 on a Monday for minor administrative matters. Harris did not ask for specific documentation unless the documentation was going to matter to whoever else was going to be in the room. She went back to the working group session and spent the next 2 hours being entirely present in it because the work in front of her was real and it required her full attention, and she had learned a long time ago that the most reliable way to handle the unknown was to be completely present in the known until the unknown became clear. At 13:45, she gathered her documentation and walked to Harris's office. She was not the first one there. When Harris's aide opened the door for her at 1400 exactly, she found that there were already 5 people in the room. Harris sat behind his desk. Patricia Rowe was to his left with a folder open in front of her. Colonel Voss sat in the chair nearest the window, posture straight, expression even. Garrett was there, which she had not expected. And beside Garrett in the chair that was farthest from the door sat a man she had never seen before. Late 50s, civilian clothes. The particular self-contained quality of someone who occupied a level of authority that did not require the external markers of rank. Harris gestured to the remaining chair without preamble. "Sit down, Lieutenant." She sat. "I'll be direct," Harris said. "This meeting is happening because three things converged in the past week, and the combination of those three things requires a decision that involves you." He looked at her steadily. "First, your sensor fusion analysis was reviewed by the full engineering team at Wright-Patterson. They have accepted your findings and are implementing all three of your proposed architectural modifications. The modifications will be incorporated into the X-51 AI system before the aircraft returns to flight. Roe, do you want to add anything to that?" Roe said, "The review took 4 days. Normally, a proposed architectural modification goes through an 8-week validation cycle. The team ran a 4-day accelerated review and reached consensus. That does not happen. For reference, in the 16 years I've been working with this team, it has never happened." She looked at Emily directly. "Your modifications are structurally elegant and technically irrefutable." The team's word, not mine, was that they should have seen it themselves 18 months ago. Emily held that for exactly 1 beat. Then she said, "What were the second and third things?" Harris almost smiled. "Almost. The second thing is that the Protocol Revision Working Group, which you are now part of, has completed its preliminary framework for how command center recovery operations will incorporate junior personnel with specialized knowledge. Voss, this is your work." Voss leaned forward slightly. "The new framework creates a defined role called Technical Specialist Observer, which gives personnel with specific system expertise a formal pathway to contribute to active recovery operations without requiring the primary team leader to explicitly invite them. It builds in a structured communication protocol 2 attempts to present information with a formal escalation pathway if both are unsuccessful." He paused. "It is designed so that what happened on October 14th does not have to happen the way it happened. The solution should not have depended on a specific commander making a specific judgment call at a specific moment of crisis. There should be a path that does not rely on individuals being at their best under the worst possible conditions." The room was quiet for a moment. Emily looked at Voss. He was looking back at her with the steady, direct attention he brought to things he had thought through completely and had decided to stand behind. "Colonel," she said carefully, "it is the framework going to work in practice. Not perfectly the first time," he said without hesitation. "Nothing works perfectly the first time. It will be better than what we had. It will be refined over time, and the refinement will happen faster because people who have the knowledge will now have the pathway to contribute it." He paused. "You'll be involved in the refinement. That is part of why you're in this room." Harris nodded, "Which brings us to the third thing." He looked at the man Emily did not recognize. "Dr. Alan Marsh. He is the Director of Advanced Systems Integration at DARPA. He has been briefed on the October 14th incident, on your technical analysis, and on the working group's preliminary framework. He requested this meeting." Marsh had been quiet through the entire opening. He was the kind of man who was quiet the way still water is quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because everything happening was happening below the surface. He looked at Emily now with the assessing, unhurried attention of someone who has done his research and is comparing what he found to what he sees. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice was measured and direct, "I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it without editing yourself for the room." "All right," Emily said. "What do you think was the most important thing you did on October 14th? The room was very still. Everyone in it already had an opinion about the answer to this question. Everyone in it was waiting to hear hers. Emily did not rush the answer. She looked at Marsh and thought about it honestly because he had asked for honesty and because she owed the question that. "I stayed in the room," she said. Marsh's expression did not change. "Explain." "The command took 22 minutes to develop. The technical work is important, but the thing that made the technical work possible was the decision to keep doing it in a room where I had been told my contribution wasn't needed. If I had left, not physically but mentally, if I had accepted the dismissal and redirected my attention to something else, I would not have been ready when the space opened. The most important thing I did was decide that the problem was worth staying with, even when the room had told me it wasn't my problem to solve." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I have spent the past 30 years working on systems integration problems at the intersection of human decision-making and machine behavior. The question that sits at the center of most of what I do is this: when a complex system fails in a way that was not anticipated, what does it take for a human being to find the recovery pathway that the system's designers missed? He leaned forward slightly. The answer is almost never purely technical. It is almost always about a quality of attention that is different from the attention the designers were paying when they built the system. A lateral attention, the kind that notices what the system is doing rather than what it is supposed to do. He paused. In 30 years, I have met perhaps 8 people who have that quality naturally, who do not have to be trained into it. I believe you are one of them. The room was quiet. Emily was quiet. What I am about to offer you, Marsh said, is not a promotion in the conventional sense. It is an invitation to join a small team at DARPA that is working on the next generation of human-AI interaction protocols for advanced flight systems. The work is classified at a level above your current clearance, which will require an expanded background review. The team is based in Arlington, Virginia. The position is a 2-year initial appointment with the possibility of extension. He paused. It is work that does not currently have a defined methodology because the methodology is part of what the team is trying to develop. That means it is work that requires exactly the kind of thinking you demonstrated on October 14th, the ability to look at a system that is doing something unexpected and ask not why it is broken, but what it is trying to do. Emily looked at him. You're asking me to help build something that doesn't exist yet. Yes, Marcia said, based on one incident and 6 weeks of technical work that 3 separate engineering teams have described as the most insightful analysis of the X-51 AI architecture they have seen since the system was built. He held her gaze. And based on 30 years of experience, identifying a specific quality of mind, which I do not often see, and which I have now seen in your documentation and in this conversation. Emily looked at Harris. Harris gave her nothing, which was its own kind of information. Harris was not going to make this decision easier for her, which meant he was not going to make it harder either. He was giving her the room. She looked at Voss. Voss looked back at her with the expression she had come to understand as his honest one, the one that appeared when he had decided something mattered enough to be straightforward about. Colonel, she said, what do you think? Voss was quiet for a moment. I think the working group needs you, he said. I think the X-51 program needs you. I think this facility would benefit from having you here for the next 20 years. He paused. I also think what Marsh is describing is the kind of work that someone with your specific capabilities does not get offered twice. And I think that if you turn it down because the program here has a use for you, you will do the work here well, and you will look back in 10 years at the road you did not take. He looked at her directly. I am not telling you what to decide. I am telling you what I see. Emily looked at Garrett. Garrett said without being asked, Go Carter. You've already changed this place. What Marsh is describing is somewhere you can change more. She looked at Roe. Roe said, the revision team will miss your input. I have spent 48 hours trying to identify someone on my staff who thinks the way you think. I have not found them. I will keep looking. She held Emily's gaze. That should tell you something about the scarcity of what you are, not a reason to stay, but a reason to go where it can be used at the largest possible scale. The room was quiet. Emily looked at Marsh. Can I have a week, she said. You can have 5 days, he said. The position needs to be filled. There are people waiting on the work. 5 days, she agreed. The meeting concluded at 15:21. Emily walked out of Harris's office and down the hallway and out of the building into the late afternoon. And she stood in the same way she had stood 6 weeks ago, breathing 3 slow breaths, letting the weight of what had just happened move through her and settle. It was a different kind of weight this time, not the weight of a crisis or a review, or the sustained effort of being professional while also being a person. This was the weight of a door opening so wide that you could not yet see what was on the other side, and the question of whether you walk through it was entirely and completely yours. She called Daniel Reeves that evening. She had not planned to. She had been sitting with her dinner and her tablet in the DARPA position documentation that Marsh had sent at 15:45, and she had been reading it for an hour and thinking about it with the careful attention she brought to most things. And at some point, she realized that the person she most wanted to talk to about it was the man who had walked into the command center at 11:47 p.m. 6 weeks ago with a bandage on his hand. She called his personal number. He picked up on the second ring. "Carter," he said. She could hear the background noise of what sounded like a kitchen voices, the particular chaos of an evening with children in it. "I'm sorry to call in the evening," she said. "I can call back." "No," he said. "Hold on." There was a brief transition, the sound of a door, and then quiet. "Okay, what's going on?" She told him about the meeting. Not all of it. Some of it was classified at levels she could not discuss, but enough of it. The DARPA position, Marsh's description of the work, the 5-day timeline, what Voss had said, what Roe had said, what Garin had said. When she finished, Reeves was quiet for a moment. "What are you afraid of?" he said. Emily blinked. It was not the question she had expected. "I'm not sure that's Carter." His voice was patient and direct, the voice of a man who had been thinking about something clearly since the night he walked into a command center to say thank you. "You just described a room full of people telling you to take an opportunity, and you spent 5 minutes telling me what they said instead of telling me what you think. That means something is sitting in you that you haven't said yet." "What are you afraid of?" She was quiet for a long moment. "That I was specific to that problem," she said finally. "October 14th, the X-51, that system, that failure mode, that particular 22-minute window where what I knew happened to be exactly what was needed. And that when I get to DARPA and start working on problems I haven't spent 14 months preparing for, I will find out that what I have is narrower than everyone is currently treating it as." Reeves was quiet. She heard him exhale. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." "On October 14th, when I was in that aircraft and the controls weren't responding, I went through everything I knew. 38 years of flying, 12 years of test programs, every emergency procedure I had ever been trained on. I went through all of it. I tried all of it." He paused, "and none of it worked. And I got to a place, not a place of giving up, but a place where I had exhausted what I knew, and I was sitting with that fact. And then your command came through and the aircraft responded, and I was flying again. And what I felt in that moment was not just relief." He paused again, and she could hear him choosing words carefully, the way people do when they are trying to be exact about something that matters. "What I felt was the recognition that the thing that saved me was something I did not know, something I had not trained for, something that existed outside the boundaries of my 38 years. He was quiet for a moment. "That is not a comfortable thing for a pilot to feel, but it is an important thing because it means the boundaries are real and they can be moved. And the people who move them are the people willing to go to where the knowledge runs out and keep looking." Emily held the phone and did not say anything. "You are not specific to October 14th, Reeves said. "You are specific to the edge of what is known. And that edge moves. It is always moving. What Marsh is offering you is a place to stand at the edge and push." He paused. "Sophie's going to want to know what you decided, by the way. She's been asking." Emily laughed. It was not the polished, contained kind of response she had been producing for 6 weeks. It was the real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere beneath the professional surface. "Tell her I'm thinking about it," Emily said. "I'll tell her," Reeves said. "She'll have an opinion." "I know," Emily said. "That's why I said thinking about it and not know." She heard him laugh too, the genuine kind, the kind that meant she had landed the line exactly right. "Good night, Carter," he said. "Good night, Captain." She sat with her tablet after the call, the DARPA documentation still on the screen, and she made the decision that she had actually already made, somewhere in the middle of the conversation with Reeves, in the same way that most important decisions are made not at the moment you announce them, but at some prior moment when the truth of them becomes clear and you just haven't said it out loud yet. She was going to Arlington. She called her mother next. Her mother's reaction was a sound that was not quite a word, but that Emily had heard her whole life and understood perfectly, the sound of a woman who is trying very hard not to cry and mostly succeeding. "Virginia," her mother said. "Virginia," Emily confirmed. "You'll come home first." "I'll come home first." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Emily, when you were 9 years old, you took apart the radio in the kitchen to see how it worked. You put it back together in 3 hours. Your father and I never told you, but we stood in the doorway watching you the whole time. We didn't say anything because we didn't want to interrupt you." She paused. "We knew then, whatever it was you were going to do with your life, it was going to be something that nobody expected." Emily closed her eyes. "Mom," she said. "Go to Virginia," her mother said. "Go where the work needs you." The 5 days pass the way days pass when you have made a decision and are moving through the practical steps of implementing it faster than they should have, and full of a specific kind of energy that is different from the focused, steady energy of the past 6 weeks. Emily notified Harris on Tuesday morning. She completed the protocol revision working group sessions that were scheduled and submitted detailed written notes on her input for the sessions she would miss. She had a final technical handoff with the Wright-Patterson team and provided a full briefing document on the sensor fusion analysis so that the implementation could proceed without requiring her ongoing involvement. She drafted a transition plan for her systems observer role. She did everything she was supposed to do to close out her time in the Nevada program, the way she did everything thoroughly without gaps, leaving it better than she found it. On Thursday afternoon, 2 days before she was scheduled to leave, she received an invitation she had not expected. The X-51 program team was holding a small gathering, not a formal ceremony, the kind of gathering that happens in military programs where the word party would feel wrong, but where people need to mark a moment, so they call it something else. And they gather in someone's conference room, and they say the things that are hard to say in official settings. It was Colonel Voss who had organized it. Emily learned this from Garrett, who told her about it with the particular careful neutrality that Garrett used when he was telling her something he thought was important and did not want to editorialize about. She walked into the conference room at 17:30 and found most of the people from October 14th, the engineers, the communications team, Garrett Mendez, Okafor, and Voss. Harris was not there, which she understood. Harris maintained the appropriate distance from the informal dimension of his program. Rowe was on a video screen at the end of the room, appearing via link from Wright-Patterson, because Rowe had decided she wanted to be there, and geography was not going to prevent that. There was no agenda. There were no speeches, not the kind that are prepared in advance. But at some point, the room settled the way rooms settle, when something that has been pending needs to be said, and Voss stood up and said it. "We are here," he said, "because something happened 6 weeks ago that changed this program. Not the incident itself, although the incident will be written about for years. What changed the program is what came after it. The analysis, the working group, the protocol revision, the documentation that is now in 3 sets of hands at Wright-Patterson." He looked around the room. That work happened because one person decided that October 14th was not a conclusion, it was a starting point. He looked at Emily. "Lieutenant Carter, you came into this program as a systems observer. You leave it having changed how this program operates, how it thinks about its own failures, and how it will protect pilots in the future. That is not a small thing to have done in 6 weeks. It is not a small thing to have done in a career." He paused. "On behalf of the program and on behalf of Daniel Reeves, who asked me to say this specifically on his behalf because he could not be here tonight, thank you. For staying in the room, for doing the work, for refusing to be smaller than the problem required." The room was quiet for exactly 1 moment. Then Marcus Webb, the chief engineer who had said the diagnostic window was real on the night of the incident, started to clap. And the room followed him, not loudly, not with the elaborate enthusiasm of a formal celebration, but with the sustained, honest sound of people who mean it. Emily stood and received it without looking away, without the reflex to minimize it or redirect it, because she had decided, somewhere between Reeves's phone call and her mother's voice, in the 5 days of transition work, that she was done practicing the habit of making herself smaller. That the people in this room had earned the right to give her this, and she had earned the right to receive it, and denying them the clean completion of the gesture would be its own kind of dishonesty. She let them clap, then she stood up and said, "I want to say something." The room went quiet. "October 14th happened because a system did something nobody expected," she said. "It entered a state that the designers hadn't anticipated, and it locked, and it took an approach nobody had tried to get it out. That's the technical summary." She paused. "But the reason it resolved the way it did was not just the command, it was this room. It was 12 engineers who worked that problem for 2 hours without finding the answer. Because the work they did eliminated every wrong path before I got to the right one. It was 4 pilots who ran every documented procedure and proved that the documented procedures were insufficient, which is what made it possible to try something undocumented. It was Colonel Voss who spent 31 years being exactly right and then had the discipline and the honesty to recognize one moment when he was wrong and correct it in real time with a pilot's life on the line. None of that is small. None of that is incidental. What I did in 22 minutes was built on 2 hours of work that this room did. She looked around at them. I'm going to Arlington to work on problems that are bigger than October 14th, but I'm going because of what I learned here and because of what I saw in this room. Don't forget that. The room was quiet, then Okafor said, "We won't," and his voice was simple and direct and meant it. She left Nevada on Saturday morning. The drive to the airport was early enough that the desert was still in the dark, gray hour before the sun came the sky, just beginning to separate itself from the land at the edges. She drove alone, which was how she preferred it. Transitions were her own, the private bookmarks between chapters. She thought about Sophie Reeves, 7 years old, who had said the best pilots are the ones who know how the plane thinks. She thought about what it meant to be 29 and driving toward a flight that was taking her to work she did not yet know how to do, toward problems that did not yet have methodologies, towards a team that was waiting for a way of thinking that she was still in the process of understanding she had. She thought about the diagnostic window. 93 seconds, 4.2 seconds of openness. The moment where the system stepped back from its own certainty and asked whether what it believed was still true. She thought about how that was not a weakness in the design, it was the most important feature in the architecture. The moment of questioning, the built-in uncertainty that made recovery possible. She had been that window for the X-51 program. Not the recovery command, the window. The 4.2-second opening in 2 hours of closed-loop thinking where a different kind of attention could enter. DARPA was going to need her to be that. Not just once, not in one specific 22-minute crisis. Again and again across systems she had not yet seen, in failure modes that had not yet occurred, with the same quality of patient lateral attention that looked at what a system was trying to do rather than what it was doing wrong. That was the work. That was what Marsh had seen. She pulled into the departure drop-off and sat for exactly 1 moment. Her hands on the wheel, the first gray light beginning to define the edges of things. She was not afraid. She was aware of the weight of the work ahead, of the distance between where she was and where she was going, of the size of the gap between what she knew and what she was going to need to know. Aware of it and steady, she got out of the car, pulled her bag from the trunk, and walked into the terminal without looking back. Because the thing about windows is that they open in one direction, and the direction is always forward, and the pilot who understands that is the one who arrives. Emily Carter had always known how to arrive. That was never what was in question. What the world was still learning was how far she